Sometimes the things we're meant to find have been waiting for us all along. Frank Torino hadn't touched a shovel in 3 years, not since Margaret passed and left him alone in their Providence home with nothing but memories and medical bills. The August heat pressed down on his shoulders as he stood in the overgrown garden she once tended, staring at weeds that had claimed her roses. His doctor said gardening might help the arthritis, but Frank knew better. He was here because he'd run out of reasons to stay inside. The first strike of metal against stone sent vibrations up his arms. 3 feet down, something white gleamed in the dark earth. As Frank brushed away decades of New England soil, a face emerged, serene, perfect, untouched by time. The Virgin Mary gazed up at him with painted eyes that seemed too real, too knowing. That night, as he placed the statue on Margaret's old kitchen table, Frank flexed his fingers and felt no pain for the first time in years. By morning, Mrs. Castellano was pounding on his door, tears streaming down her face, babbling about her granddaughter's cancer, disappearing overnight after the child had wandered into his yard. But miracles, Frank would soon learn, always come with a price, and Margaret had left him more than just a garden to tend. What bargain had his wife made, and why had she buried the truth along with the statue? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank stared at Mrs. Castellano through the screen door, her words echoing in his ears like a prayer he didn't dare believe. Little Sophia, the 8-year-old who'd been a ghost of herself for months, pale as winter snow with a bandana covering her bald head, had somehow slipped through the gap in his fence yesterday evening while he'd been inside nursing a beer and studying the statue. "She just touched it, Frank," Mrs. Castellano whispered, her voice cracking. "Just put her little hand on the marble for maybe 10 seconds before I dragged her away. This morning, Dr. Brennan called. The scans, they're clean, completely clean. 40 years he's been practicing, and he's never seen anything like it." Frank's fingers, still impossibly limber after a night of restful sleep, gripped the doorframe. Through the gap he could see Sophia playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, her movements quick and sure, color blooming in her cheeks like spring returning to dead earth. The bandana was gone, replaced by a fine fuzz of dark hair catching the morning light. "That's—" Frank started and stopped. What was it? Impossible? A coincidence? The word miracle sat heavy on his tongue, unspoken. He'd stopped believing in those the day Margaret drew her last rattling breath in Rhode Island hospital, rosary beads tangled in her fingers, 43 years of marriage reduced to a flatline beep. Mrs. Castellano pressed her palm against the screen. "What is that thing, Frank? Where did it come from?" "I don't know. The lie came easier than expected. Truth was, he'd been asking himself the same question since dawn, when he'd awakened without the familiar grinding ache in his joints that had been his constant companion since his plumbing days ended. The statue sat exactly where he'd left it, centered on Margaret's red-checkered tablecloth, but something felt different about the kitchen, lighter, as if the air itself had been blessed. After Mrs. Castellano left, clutching a hastily scribbled prayer card she'd pressed into his hand, Frank poured coffee with steady fingers and studied his unexpected houseguest. The Virgin Mary was perhaps 18 inches tall, carved from what looked like Carrara marble, her robes painted in faded blues and whites that should have been stained or chipped after decades underground. Instead, she appeared freshly crafted, as if some Renaissance master had finished her yesterday and delivered her still warm from the studio. Her face drew him most. Serene but somehow knowing, with eyes that seemed to track his movement around the room. Margaret would have loved her, would have built a shrine in the living room corner with candles and plastic flowers from the dollar store. The thought brought an unexpected stab of longing. Frank had met Margaret Donovan at St. Bartholomew's in 1975, both of them 23 and certain that faith and love could conquer anything life threw their way. They'd prayed together for children that never came, held each other through miscarriages that left holes in their hearts, and finally made peace with being enough for each other. Margaret's faith never wavered, even when the cancer came calling with its surgical scars and chemical warfare. She'd whispered prayers right up to the end, believing in a plan Frank couldn't see. Now this statue sat in their kitchen like an echo of her devotion, unearthed from soil that hadn't been disturbed since... Frank paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. When exactly had they moved into this house? 1979, wasn't it? He remembered the mortgage papers, Margaret's excitement over the small garden plot, her plans for tomatoes and herbs. But the statue had been buried at least 3 feet down, in earth packed hard by decades of seasons. Someone had put it there long before they'd arrived. The doorbell rang again, followed by urgent knocking. Through the front window, Frank glimpsed a small crowd gathering on his sidewalk. Neighbors he recognized and some he didn't, all talking in hushed, excited tones. Word traveled fast in Federal Hill, especially when it involved children and answered prayers. His phone buzzed with a text from his nephew Tony, heard crazy stuff about Aunt Em's place. Call me. Then another from his sister Rose in Boston. Mrs. C says Sophia's cured. What's going on? Frank silenced the phone and retreated to the kitchen, where the statue waited with her patient smile. For 62 years, he'd lived a simple life. Fix pipes, love his wife, pay taxes, try not to hurt anybody. He wasn't equipped for miracles or the chaos they apparently brought. But as he reached for the Virgin's marble face, drawn by an impulse he couldn't name, his fingers trembled. Not from arthritis, that pain had vanished like morning mist, but from something deeper. Fear, maybe, or hope, which in Frank's experience often amounted to the same thing. The marble was warm beneath his palm, impossibly so, and for just a moment he could have sworn he felt a pulse beating beneath the stone. Like a heart, steady and sure, pumping grace through painted veins. Outside, the crowd was growing larger. Frank pulled his hand away from the statue and stepped back from the window, his heart hammering against his ribs. 23 people now clustered on the sidewalk, maybe more. Mrs. Benedetto from 3 houses down held her grandson's wheelchair at the edge of the crowd, the boy's legs twisted from cerebral palsy, hope blazing in her dark eyes. Behind them, Frank recognized old Mr. Torino, no relation despite the shared name, leaning heavily on his walker, and Maria Santos clutching a framed photograph that probably showed someone she'd lost. This wasn't how his mornings usually went. Normally by 8:30, he'd have finished his coffee and would be settling into the living room recliner with yesterday's Providence Journal, reading the obituaries first to see who'd beaten him to the finish line. Then sports, the Red Sox's perpetual disappointments, followed by the crossword puzzle that he'd work with the same methodical patience he'd once used to snake drain lines. Margaret had always finished the crosswords faster, her neat handwriting filling the squares, while he was still puzzling over 3 down. After the paper, he'd typically drive his 15-year-old Honda Civic to Stop and Shop for whatever he needed. Usually not much, since cooking for one felt like an exercise in futility. Sometimes he'd swing by Constantino's market for the good Italian bread, the kind Margaret used to buy for Sunday dinners when they'd host his sister Rose and her kids. Those dinners had stopped after the funeral. The house felt too empty for celebrations. Tuesdays, he volunteered at the senior center, helping other old-timers with basic home repairs they couldn't manage anymore. The irony wasn't lost on him, a retired plumber whose own house was slowly falling apart. The front steps needed repointing, the gutters sagged like tired shoulders, and Doneget started on the leak under the kitchen sink that he kept meaning to fix. But working on other people's problems felt easier than confronting his own decay. Thursday afternoons belonged to Father Marconi at St. Bartholomew's, where Frank helped maintain the church's ancient boiler system. The old priest never pushed too hard about Frank's absence from Sunday Mass, understanding that some griefs ran deeper than ritual could reach. They talked mostly about practical things, water pressure, heating bills, the cost of replacing 40-year-old pipes, while carefully avoiding discussions of faith, salvation, or why good women died while bitter old men like Frank kept breathing. Evenings were the hardest. He'd heat up a frozen dinner, eat it in front of the television while watching whatever was on. Usually some cooking show that reminded him how Margaret used to fill the kitchen with the smell of garlic and basil, or a medical drama that brought back too many memories of hospital corridors and the sound of machines keeping time with failing hearts. By 9 o'clock, he'd climb the stairs to the bedroom he'd once shared, brush his teeth at the sink where Margaret's cosmetics had sat for 4 decades, and lie awake listening to the house settle around him like old bones. That routine had been his anchor for 2 years now, each day a careful repetition of manageable tasks that kept him from thinking too hard about the silence where laughter used to live. He'd built a life of small rituals and smaller expectations, content to let time pass without asking too much from it. But now, these people stood outside his door, clutching their pain and their desperate hope, looking at his house like it held answers he'd never claimed to have. Mrs. Benedetto pushed the wheelchair closer to his front gate, and Frank could see her lips moving in silent prayer. The boy, what was his name, Vincent, stared at the house with wide, trusting eyes that made Frank's chest tight. He thought about Margaret's reaction to crowds like this. She'd have thrown open the front door by now, invited everyone in for coffee and cookies she'd have magically produced from somewhere, listened to every story with the patience of a saint. She'd have known what to say, how to comfort without making promises she couldn't keep. Margaret had possessed an endless capacity for other people's suffering, absorbing their pain like a sponge and somehow transforming it into something bearable. Frank had no such gift. He fixed pipes because pipes followed logical rules. Water flowed downhill, joints leaked when they weren't properly sealed, pressure built until it found release. People were messier, their problems resistant to simple solutions. He'd learned to love one person deeply, completely, and when she died, that particular muscle had atrophied from disuse. The statue seemed to watch him from the kitchen table, her painted eyes holding secrets he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. Whatever was happening here, miracle, coincidence, mass hysteria, it threatened to tear apart the careful simplicity he'd constructed from the ruins of his marriage. These people wanted something from him, something he'd never asked to give. His phone buzzed again. Tony, probably, or Rose, or any of the dozen relatives who'd crawl out of the woodwork once word spread through the family network. By tonight, his quiet house would be the center of a storm he had no idea how to navigate. Frank closed his eyes and tried to remember what normal felt like. The silence lasted exactly 37 seconds. Frank counted them like heartbeats, before Mrs. Benedetto's voice cut through the morning air like a blade through silk. "Please, Mr. Torino." Her words carried the weight of every sleepless night she'd spent watching her grandson struggle. Just let Vincent touch it, just for a moment. Frank opened his eyes to find the crowd had pressed closer to his fence, their faces painted with the kind of desperate hope he recognized from oncology waiting rooms. The same expression Margaret had worn during those final weeks, when experimental treatments became Hail Mary passes and doctors spoke in carefully measured tones about quality time and making peace. Through the screen door's mesh, he watched Vincent raise one trembling hand toward the house, as if blessing could travel through air and glass, and the accumulated disappointments of 8 years spent trapped in a body that wouldn't obey. The boy's gesture broke something loose in Frank's chest, a sound that might have been a sob or might have been his last defense crumbling. His phone erupted in his hand. Tony's name flashed on the screen, followed immediately by another buzz, then another. Text messages cascaded down the display. Channel 10 wants comment from his nephew, Father Marconi, asking questions from Rose. Parking on Atwell's backing up to downtown from a number he didn't recognize. Frank stared at the phone like it had transformed into a snake. Channel 10. How did? A white van rounded the corner onto his street, its satellite dish gleaming in the August sun like some technological vulture. Action News 10 emblazoned in red letters across the side. Behind it came another van, Fox Providence, and then a third vehicle Frank couldn't identify, but whose occupants were already unloading cameras and microphones with the efficiency of an invading army. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, then immediately felt guilty for taking the Lord's name in vain. while standing 3 feet from what might be a genuine religious artifact. Margaret would have given him that look, the one that said she was praying for his soul while simultaneously wanting to box his ears. The first reporter, a blonde woman in a navy blazer that looked like it cost more than Frank's monthly grocery budget, was already pushing through the crowd, her camera operator trailing behind like a well-trained dog. She moved with the predatory grace of someone who'd built a career on other people's tragedies, her smile bright and sharp as surgical steel. "Sir? Sir?" She'd spotted him at the window. "Channel 10 News. We understand there's been a miraculous healing in your home. Could we get a statement?" The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, their attention split now between Frank's house and the promise of television fame. Mrs. Benedetto clutched Vincent's wheelchair handles tighter, positioning him where the cameras might catch his face, his need, his impossible hope for a different ending to his story. Frank stumbled backward into his kitchen, his newly flexible hands shaking as he set down the phone. The statue sat exactly where he'd left her, serene amid the chaos gathering outside, but something had changed in her painted expression. Or maybe something had changed in him, in the way desperate circumstances could strip away illusions and leave only the raw truth of what mattered. The marble virgin seemed to pulse with warmth, and Frank found himself remembering the night Margaret died, how she'd gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered something he hadn't quite caught over the hospital machinery. He'd assumed it was another prayer, another appeal to the God who'd let cancer grow in her lungs like poisonous flowers. But now, staring at this impossible artifact that had emerged from Earth that held 40 years of secrets, he wondered if those final words had been meant for him to remember later, when choice and consequence collided in his quiet kitchen. The doorbell rang with the persistence of someone who wouldn't be ignored. Through the front window, Frank could see the reporter at his door, her cameraman framing the shot to capture both her manufactured concern and the growing crowd of supplicants behind her. More vehicles were arriving, cars with out-of-state plates, an SUV full of people clutching rosaries, even what looked like a church bus from somewhere in Massachusetts. His phone buzzed again. "Father Marconi this time, Frank. People are saying impossible things. I'm coming over." Frank stared at the message, then at the statue, then at the chaos blooming outside his windows like some mad garden. For 2 years, he'd lived in careful isolation, tending his grief like a faithful gardener, asking nothing from the world except to be left alone with his memories and his crossword puzzles and his slowly calcifying heart. But choice, he realized, wasn't always about what you wanted. Sometimes it was about what you could live with afterward. Margaret had known that. It was written in every sacrifice she'd made, every prayer she'd whispered for other people's children when their own had never drawn breath. The statue's marble eyes seemed to be waiting for his answer. Frank backed away from the window until his shoulders hit the kitchen wall, the cool plaster a shock against his overheated skin. The statue sat 3 feet away, but it might as well have been 3 miles for all the comfort it offered. Every marble curve seemed to mock him now, this thing that had turned his careful solitude into a circus, his grief into a spectacle for strangers with cameras and agendas he couldn't begin to understand. The doorbell rang again, followed by the sharp rap of knuckles against wood. Professional knocking, insistent, the kind that said, "We're not leaving until you answer." "Mr. Torino?" The reporter's voice carried through the door, honeyed with false sympathy. "We just want to help share this beautiful story with the community. People are calling it a miracle." Miracle. The word hit him like a slap. Frank pressed his palms against his ears, but he couldn't block out the sound of hope multiplying outside his windows, car doors slamming, voices rising in excitement, the scrape of wheelchair wheels against pavement. Each sound felt like another weight added to a scale he'd never asked to balance. What did he know about miracles? He was a plumber, for Christ's sake. He understood water pressure and pipe joints and the simple logic of things that could be fixed with the right tools and enough patience. He'd spent 43 years married to a woman who saw God's hand in everything, in recovered wedding rings pulled from garbage disposals, in customers who paid their bills on time, in the way morning light slanted through their bedroom window. Margaret had been the believer in their marriage, the one who knelt beside their bed each night, whispering prayers for neighbors and strangers while Frank counted the day's receipts. And where had all that faith gotten her? 6 feet under in St. Francis Cemetery, her rosary beads buried with fingers that would never again trace their familiar path. The phone buzzed against the kitchen counter. "Tony again, Uncle Frank. Answer your damn phone. Channel 6 just called Mom, asking for family comment." Family comment. As if Frank had consulted the Torino clan before digging up his backyard. As if he'd planned for Sofia Castellano to touch a marble statue and suddenly sprout hair where chemotherapy had left only smooth scalp. As if any of this made sense outside of the fever dreams that had plagued him since Margaret's funeral, dreams where she stood at the foot of their bed shaking her head sadly, telling him he didn't understand, had never understood, would never understand until it was too late. Through the kitchen window, he could see Mrs. Benedetto wheeling Vincent closer to the house. The boy's legs, twisted since birth into shapes that defied every prayer his grandmother had whispered, seemed even more fragile against the backdrop of gathering crowds. His dark eyes were fixed on Frank's front door with the intensity of someone who learned not to expect much from the world, but couldn't quite stop hoping anyway. Frank's chest tightened. That look, it was the same expression Margaret had worn during those last hospital visits, when experimental treatments became desperate gambits and nurses spoke in whispers about managing expectations. The same trust mixed with terror, faith wrestling with the bitter experience of watching God say no to every plea that mattered. He couldn't do this, wouldn't do this. Whatever forces had brought this statue to his kitchen table, whatever cosmic joke had transformed his quiet retirement into a religious revival, he wanted no part of it. Let someone else bear the weight of other people's desperate hopes. Let someone else explain why some children got healed while others, like the son he and Margaret had lost before his first breath, remained. Buried in consecrated ground with nothing but marble angels to mark their passing. The memory hit him without warning, Margaret's face in the hospital delivery room, 28 years old and broken in ways that never fully mended. They'd named him Anthony, after Frank's father, and buried him in a white casket small enough to carry with one hand. Margaret had insisted on a full mass, on treating their stillborn son like the person he would have become, and Frank had stood silent beside her while Father DiMarco spoke about God's mysterious plan. Mysterious plan. Another phrase Frank had learned to hate, along with everything happens for a reason and he's in a better place now. As if death was just poor timing, as if loss was simply a matter of divine logistics gone temporarily awry. The statue's painted eyes seemed to bore into him now, holding secrets he didn't want to unlock. Where had it come from? Who had buried it in soil that wouldn't be theirs for another year? And why did touching it feel like grasping Margaret's hand during those final moments when machines counted down the space between heartbeats? Outside, Father Marconi's familiar Honda pulled to the curb behind the news vans. The old priest climbed out slowly, his black cassock drawing immediate attention from the cameras. Frank watched him survey the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen faith and desperation collide too many times to count. The statue waited, patient as stone, for Frank's decision. Frank's hands moved before his mind could stop them, reaching for the statue with the same instinctive certainty that had guided him through 40 years of midnight emergency calls, burst pipes that couldn't wait for morning, flooded basements that demanded immediate action. His arthritic fingers, still moving without their familiar morning stiffness, wrapped around the marble base. The Virgin Mary felt warm against his palms, impossibly warm for stone that had spent decades buried in New England soil. As he lifted her, Frank caught his reflection in the kitchen window, a 62-year-old man holding what might be the answer to every prayer whispered outside his door, or the key to a nightmare he didn't yet understand. Either way, there was no pretending it away anymore. The doorbell had stopped ringing, but the crowd's murmur had grown louder, more urgent. Through the glass he could see Father Marconi making his way through the gathering, his weathered hands raised in blessing and crowd control in equal measure. The old priest's presence would buy Frank maybe 10 minutes before the questions became demands, before his kitchen became a shrine he'd never asked to tend. Frank carried the statue toward the front door, each step feeling like a betrayal of the careful isolation he'd built around his grief. Margaret would have made this choice hours ago, would have thrown open every window and door to let the desperate inside. But Margaret had possessed a faith that could move mountains. Frank had only doubt and a lifetime of learning that pipes leaked, joints failed, and even the most careful repairs eventually gave way to time. His free hand turned the deadbolt with a click that sounded like fate settling into place. The reporter saw him first, her predatory smile brightening as her cameraman swung the lens toward Frank's face. "Mr. Torino, can you confirm that miraculous healings have occurred in your home?" Frank ignored her, his attention fixed on Mrs. Benedetto and Vincent. The boy's eyes widened as Frank stepped onto his porch, the statue cradled against his chest like a sleeping child. Around them, the crowd pressed closer. People he recognized from the neighborhood mixed with strangers who'd driven from God knew where, all of them united by the terrible hope that this time, this moment, their prayers might finally be answered. "Vincent," Frank said, his voice carrying farther than he'd intended. The crowd quieted, even the reporter's questions fading to nothing. "Come here, son." Mrs. Benedetto pushed the wheelchair forward, her wrinkled hands trembling on the handles. "Mr. Torino, we don't need much. Just a moment, just a touch." Frank knelt beside the wheelchair, bringing himself to Vincent's eye level. This close, he could see the intelligence burning in the boy's gaze, the sharp mind trapped in a body that had never worked the way it should. It reminded him of Margaret during those final weeks, her spirit intact while cancer carved away everything else, leaving only the essential truth of who she'd always been. "I don't know if this will help," Frank said quietly, meaning it. "I don't know what this thing is or why it was buried in my yard. But if you want to try—" Vincent nodded, his head bobbing with the uncontrolled motion that had marked his movements since birth. Frank lifted the statue, positioning it so the boy could reach the marble hands folded in prayer. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath, cameras recording every nuance of hope and desperation playing across young features. Vincent's fingertips brushed the statue's surface. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Frank felt it, the same pulse of warmth he'd experienced in his kitchen, but stronger now, more focused. It flowed through the marble like electricity through copper pipes, and Vincent's eyes went wide with surprise. His twisted legs, which had never supported his weight, gave a small tremor. Not movement exactly, but something that might become movement given time and faith and whatever forces had brought this artifact into Frank's unwilling care. The boys whispered, "Oh," carried across the crowd like a prayer made audible. Father Marconi appeared at Frank's shoulder, his presence both reassuring and complicating in ways Frank couldn't yet calculate. "Frank," the priest said quietly, "we need to talk." The reporter pushed closer, her microphone extended like a weapon. "Vincent, can you tell us what you're feeling? Has there been a healing?" Frank stood abruptly, still clutching the statue, suddenly understanding that this moment, this choice to step outside his door with marble hope in his hands, had changed everything irreversibly. There would be no returning to crossword puzzles and frozen dinners, no hiding behind the careful routines he'd built from loneliness and loss. These people, their desperate faith, the statue's impossible warmth, it had all become his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. Margaret would have known what to do next. Frank could only hold tight to warm marble and pray he wouldn't destroy whatever grace had been placed in his unworthy hands. The reporter's microphone thrust toward Vincent like a sword, but Father Marconi stepped smoothly between them, his black cassock creating a barrier Frank had never been more grateful for. "The boy needs space," the priest said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years managing parish crises. "This is not a press conference." Frank felt Vincent's grandmother's eyes on him, wide with a mixture of terror and hope that made his stomach clench. The boy's legs had stopped trembling, but something fundamental had shifted in his posture, a straightening that hadn't been there moments before. Not healing, not yet, but possibility humming through twisted limbs like current through old wiring. "Inside," Frank said, surprising himself with the decisiveness in his voice. "Everyone inside needs to come in. Everyone else." He gestured at the growing crowd, the cameras, the cars still arriving from directions he couldn't track. "Give us an hour." The reporter's manufactured smile faltered. "Mr. Torino, the public has a right to know." "The public has a right to wait," Father Marconi interrupted, positioning himself like a goalie defending sacred ground. "This family deserves privacy while they process what's happened." Frank guided Mrs. Benedetto and Vincent toward his front door, the statue still warm against his ribs. Behind them, he could hear the priest fielding questions with the diplomatic skill of someone who learned to speak hope without making promises, to acknowledge miracles without guaranteeing them. His living room had never hosted more than Tony's occasional visits and the home health aide who'd checked on him after his hip surgery. Now it filled with the Benedettos, Father Marconi, and an energy that seemed to pulse from the marble Virgin in Frank's hands. Mrs. Benedetto helped Vincent transfer from his wheelchair to the couch, her movements careful but less protective than usual, as if his body had become something new between the front porch and the coffee table. "Tell me what you felt," Frank said, settling into his recliner with the statue across his lap. The painted eyes seemed to watch them all, ancient and patient in a way that made the chaos outside feel temporary, manageable. Vincent's voice came stronger than Frank had ever heard it, like electricity but warm, like... The boy struggled for words that could contain the impossible, like "my legs remembered something they never knew." Father Marconi leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped in prayer or concern. "Frank, I need you to understand what's happening here. Word is spreading beyond the neighborhood. Bishop Murphy is already asking questions. The diocesan office has protocols for situations like this." "Protocols?" Frank felt a laugh bubbling up, sharp with hysteria. "What's the Catholic Church's protocol for plumbing contractors who dig up religious artifacts that might or might not heal children?" "Investigation," Father Marconi said simply. "Documentation. Verification. The Church has seen enough false miracles to approach genuine ones carefully." The word genuine hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications Frank wasn't ready to unpack. Outside, car doors continued slamming, voices rising in excitement or argument he couldn't distinguish. His phone buzzed constantly from the kitchen counter. Tony, Rose, numbers he didn't recognize. The modern world demanding answers he didn't possess. Vincent was staring at his legs with the intensity of a scientist observing a critical experiment. His feet, usually turned inward at impossible angles, had shifted toward something approaching normal alignment. Still not normal. Frank wasn't sure anything about this situation qualified as normal, but different enough to make Mrs. Benedetto cross herself and whisper prayers in Italian. "Who buried it?" Father Marconi asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the statue. "This didn't appear spontaneously, Frank. Someone placed it in your yard deliberately, probably decades ago. The marble shows no weathering, no soil stains. It was protected somehow, preserved." The question Frank had been avoiding crystallized into something he couldn't ignore. His house had belonged to the Rossellis before he and Margaret bought it in 1979. Old Mr. Rosselli had died that winter, his widow moving to live with her daughter in Cranston. They'd left behind an overgrown garden and stories about Mrs. Rosselli's devotion to the Virgin Mary, her bedroom shrine that neighbors could see through lace curtains. But why bury a statue? Why hide something meant to be revered? "I need to make some calls," Father Marconi said, producing a cell phone that looked ancient compared to the reporter's equipment outside. "The bishop will want documentation, photographs, medical records if Vincent shows continued improvement." "What if I don't want any of this documented?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. Choice had left his hands the moment Vincent's legs trembled with new possibility. Mrs. Benedetto spoke for the first time since entering his house. Mr. Torino, my grandson has lived 11 years without walking, without hope of walking. If God has chosen your hands to hold his grace." She gestured toward the statue, tears tracking down cheeks worn smooth by decades of worry. "How can any of us turn away?" The statue's marble surface pulsed once, gently, like a heart finding its rhythm. Outside, Frank could hear Father Marconi on the phone, his voice measured and careful as he explained the unexplainable to men who'd built careers on faith, tempered by skepticism. Vincent looked up at Frank with eyes that held less pain than they had an hour ago. "Thank you," the boy said simply, and Frank understood that gratitude, not miracles, was the burden he'd truly inherited. Frank sat alone in his kitchen at 3 a.m, the statue positioned on the table between cold coffee and the stack of business cards Father Marconi had left behind. Medical examiners, church officials, specialists in what the priest had carefully termed extraordinary phenomena. Each card represented another person who would want to poke, prod, and document whatever impossible thing had taken root in his house. The Benedettos had left an hour after Vincent managed to shift his weight without assistance, not walking, but something closer to the possibility of walking than the boy had ever achieved. Mrs. Benedetto had kissed Frank's hands before departing, her tears mixing with whispered prayers of gratitude that felt heavier than any payment he'd ever received for 40 years of fixing other people's broken pipes. Now the statue waited, its painted eyes reflecting the overhead light in ways that seemed too knowing, too aware. Frank had tried moving it to the basement, to the garage, anywhere that might contain whatever energy pulsed beneath its marble surface. But each time he lifted it, his arthritis vanished completely, his spine straightened, and something that felt dangerously like hope crept through his chest. Margaret's journal lay open beside his elbow, the leather cover worn smooth by hands that had once traced every worry across its pages. He'd found it while searching for insurance papers, tucked behind her jewelry box like a secret she'd meant to keep forever. The final entry was dated 3 days before her funeral, written in handwriting so shaky it barely resembled hers. "Frank will never understand what I've done. The promise I made when we lost Anthony, the bargain I struck in that hospital chapel while our son grew cold in my arms. Mrs. Rosselli warned me about the price, but I couldn't bear the thought of other mothers feeling what I felt, so I buried it deep, deeper than sorrow, and prayed Frank would never have reason to dig." His hands trembled as he turned the page, revealing detailed sketches of the Virgin Mary statue. The same marble folds, the same serene expression, the same hands folded in eternal prayer. Margaret had drawn it dozens of times, each image accompanied by notes that made his blood run cold. The Castellano baby, fever broken after 3 days of prayer. Mr. Torino's heart attack, survived when doctors said impossible. Rose's miscarriage prevented, but took Mrs. Chen's pregnancy instead. Entry after entry, miracle after miracle, each blessing shadowed by an equivalent loss somewhere else in the neighborhood. Margaret had been keeping score, documenting the statue's power with the methodical precision she'd once applied to their household budget. She'd known. For 40 years, she'd known what lay buried beneath their tomato plants, and she'd never said a word. The worst entries came near the end, Margaret's handwriting growing increasingly desperate. "I felt it calling when the cancer started, whispering that it could help, that I only needed to dig it up and ask. But I know the cost now. I've seen too much. If Frank finds it after I'm gone, if he's desperate enough to use it, God help us all. Some blessings are too expensive to accept." Frank closed the journal with shaking hands. Outside, news vans still lined his street, despite the late hour, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metal prayers. The reporters had finally gone home, but they'd be back with sunrise, armed with cameras and questions he couldn't answer without destroying whatever peace his neighbors had left. His phone buzzed. "Tony again. Uncle Frank, Channel 12 is saying you're claiming to have a miraculous healing statue. Please tell me this is some kind of mistake." Frank stared at the message until the screen went dark, his reflection superimposed over his nephew's worry. "How do you explain that your dead wife made a deal with forces beyond understanding? How do you tell people that every miracle comes with a price tag someone else has to pay?" The statue pulsed once, gently, and Frank felt his arthritis return like a tide rolling back to shore. Pain flooded his joints, his spine curved back into its familiar hunch, and his hands cramped around the phone with the grinding ache he'd lived with for years. The warmth was gone, leaving only marble that felt exactly like the stone it appeared to be. But upstairs, through the thin walls that separated his house from the Morettis, he could hear Mrs. Moretti coughing, the deep, wet sound that had been getting worse all summer. The same cough Margaret had developed 6 months before her diagnosis, when doctors were still talking about seasonal allergies and suggested cough drops. Frank's hand reached toward the statue before he could stop himself, then froze inches from the marble surface. Margaret's journal lay open between them, her final warning stark against yellowed pages. "Some blessings are too expensive to accept." Dawn was still 3 hours away, but Frank could already hear the sound of cars arriving, engines cutting through the pre-dawn quiet as desperate people began another pilgrimage to his kitchen table. Each headlight that swept across his walls brought new hopes he might fulfill and new prices he'd have to calculate. The statue waited, patient as stone, for his choice. Frank's fingers closed around the marble, just as his front door exploded inward. "Where is she?" The voice belonged to Detective Maria Santos, but Frank barely recognized the woman who once helped him file the police report when Margaret's pain medication went missing. Her dark hair hung in tangles around hollow eyes, and her service weapon trembled in hands that looked like they hadn't slept in days. Behind her, more figures pushed through the shattered doorframe, faces Frank had seen on his porch, begging for miracles, now twisted with something far more dangerous than hope. Mrs. Chen from 2 blocks over, whose grandson had been born healthy the same week Margaret's journal recorded a prevented miscarriage. Vincent's Uncle Paul, still wearing his EMT uniform from the night shift. A dozen others, maybe more, filling his kitchen with the weight of 40 years' worth of bargains coming due. "Maria," Father Marconi's voice cut through the chaos as he stepped from Frank's living room, still wearing the clothes he'd fallen asleep in after their long conversation about church protocols. "Put the gun down. We can discuss." "Discuss?" Detective Santos laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. "My daughter had her first seizure an hour after that boy's legs started working. Sophie's been healthy for 16 years, Father. 16 years without a single medical problem, and now she's convulsing on my kitchen floor while Vincent Benedetto is upstairs learning to stand." The statue pulsed against Frank's palms, warm and insistent, and suddenly he could see it all, the invisible threads connecting every miracle to its shadow, every healing to its price. Margaret hadn't just documented the trades, she'd mapped them like a plumber, tracing water flow through a neighborhood's pipes. The Castellano baby's fever had broken because Mrs. Chen's newborn developed pneumonia. Mr. Torino's heart had kept beating while 3 blocks away, a healthy construction worker dropped dead at 2008. For 40 years, the statue had been balancing the books, and now the ledger was coming due all at once. Mrs. Chen stepped closer, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "My Jenny was supposed to die at birth. The doctors said her heart couldn't support life outside the womb. But she lived, and she grew up, and she gave me grandchildren." Her weathered hands gestured toward the statue. "Now those grandchildren are sick, all 3 of them, as of midnight tonight. Same heart condition Jenny should have died from." Paul Torino, no relation despite the name, pulled off his EMT cap with shaking hands. "The Benedetto kid isn't the first one you've helped, is he? My partner ran the call logs. 3 cardiac events tonight in the neighborhood. 3 healthy adults, all dropped dead within hours of that wheelchair kid taking his first steps." Frank felt the weight of their grief pressing against his chest like water in a burst pipe, and he understood why Margaret had buried this thing so deep. She'd tried to contain the damage, to hide the connections that were becoming impossible to ignore now that the miracles were happening faster, closer together, with witnesses and cameras recording every impossible moment. "The girl who died in the car accident last month," Detective Santos continued, her weapon still trained on Frank, though her hands had steadied with purpose. "Emma Rosselli, age 12. Ring any bells? Because that was the same night you healed Mrs. Patterson's diabetes. A perfectly healthy kid slides off the road for no reason, and suddenly a 70-year-old woman's blood sugar is normal for the first time in 30 years. Father Marconi stepped between Frank and the gun, his black cassock billowing like protective wings. "This isn't how we solve this. Violence won't bring anyone back, won't heal anyone's children." "Then what will?" Mrs. Chen's voice broke on the question that hung over them all like incense in a closed church. "How do we undo 40 years of borrowed time? How do we choose which children live and which ones pay the price?" The statue's warmth spread up Frank's arms, and for a moment he felt Margaret's presence as clearly as if she were standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice whispering the truth she'd spent decades hiding. The Virgin Mary had never been about miracles. She'd been about choice, about the terrible mathematics of faith when applied to real suffering, real loss, real desperation. Margaret had made her bargain in a hospital chapel while their stillborn son grew cold, trading unknown futures for the power to heal, but every miracle had demanded its payment, and now the neighborhood that had secretly benefited from those healings for 4 decades was learning the cost of grace. Frank looked into Detective Santos's desperate eyes and saw his own reflection. A man holding power he'd never asked for, forced to choose between helping and harming, with no way to tell the difference. The statue pulsed once more, and Frank finally understood why Margaret had warned him. The real ordeal wasn't using the power. It was deciding whether anyone deserved to. The weight of Detective Santos's desperation hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a grease fire, and Frank realized with growing horror that the gun wasn't the real threat. It was the choice she was forcing him to make: save her daughter by condemning someone else's child, or watch Sophie Santos die to preserve whatever fragile balance Margaret had spent 40 years maintaining. "You don't understand," Frank said, his voice cracking like old pipes under pressure. "I can't control who pays. I can't choose whose life gets traded." "Then destroy it." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her grief transforming into something sharp and practical. "Smash the thing, bury it deeper, end this." Frank's hands tightened around the marble instinctively, and the statue's warmth flared like a struck match. His arthritis vanished again, his spine straightened, and for one perfect moment he felt like the man he'd been before age and loss had bent him into permanent supplication. But with the healing came something else. A whisper that might have been Margaret's voice or his own desperate imagination: "It won't end. Breaking it just means you lose any chance of controlling it." "I tried," he whispered, remembering the hours he'd spent in his basement with a sledgehammer, unable to bring himself to strike. "God help me. I tried to smash it. But if I destroy the only thing that can heal these children—" "What children?" Detective Santos's voice climbed toward hysteria. "You think this is healing? My daughter is dying, Frank. Right now, while we're standing here talking about balance sheets and cosmic justice, she's dying because you decided some crippled kid's legs were worth more than her life." Father Marconi made a small sound of protest, but Paul Torino cut him off. "No, she's right. 3 more cardiac arrests came over the radio during my drive here. All in the neighborhood, all healthy people who should have lived another 40 years. This thing isn't healing anyone, it's just moving death around like shuffling cards." Frank looked down at the statue, its painted eyes seeming to reflect his kitchen light with impossible depth. Margaret's journal lay open on the table, 40 years of careful accounting spread across pages that suddenly felt like a suicide note. She'd known this moment would come, had seen it building like pressure in a closed system. Every miracle she'd documented had been borrowed time, and now the loan was coming due with compound interest. "There has to be a way," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he could feel their emptiness. Some way to heal without the cost, to save everyone. There isn't. Mrs. Chen's voice carried the finality of a funeral bell. My grandmother told stories about things like this, old country stories about saints who could heal the sick and raise the dead, but always at a price, always with blood. She gestured toward the statue with hands that shook like autumn leaves. You think this is Catholic? You think the Virgin Mary demands children's lives in trade for miracles? Frank stared at the marble face, seeing it clearly for the first time. The features were wrong, too sharp, too knowing, too ancient. The eyes held depths that spoke of bargains struck in shadows, of power that predated Christ by centuries. Whatever Margaret had found buried in the Rosselli garden, it wore the Virgin's face like a mask over something far older and hungrier. Margaret knew, he whispered, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. She knew what it really was, and she used it anyway. 40 years of trading other people's lives for healing, and she never told anyone because she couldn't bear to stop. The statue pulsed once, and Frank felt a presence pressing against his mind. Not Margaret's voice, but something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. It showed him visions of Sophie Santos convulsing in her bedroom, of Mrs. Chen's grandchildren growing weaker by the hour, of Vincent Benedetto taking tentative steps across his bedroom floor. The choice was simple, mathematical, inevitable: choose who lives and who dies, or watch them all suffer while he stood paralyzed by the impossibility of perfect justice. Detective Santos raised her weapon, and Frank realized she wasn't pointing it at him anymore. The barrel was aimed squarely at the statue, her finger tight on the trigger, her eyes blazing with the desperate clarity of a mother with nothing left to lose. "If you won't choose," she said, "then I will." The shot shattered the pre-dawn silence, echoing off kitchen walls like thunder in a closed space. Frank watched the bullet strike marble with a sound like breaking bells, watched the statue crack from base to crown in a spider web of fractures that seemed to pulse with escaping light. Then the screaming began, not from the kitchen, but from every house in the neighborhood, as 40 years of borrowed miracles collapsed all at once. The light bleeding from the statue's fractures wasn't the warm glow Frank had grown accustomed to. It was the sickly yellow of infection, of something ancient and wounded thrashing in its death throes. The marble face split down the middle, one painted eye rolling grotesquely as the crack widened, and Frank felt 40 years of carefully maintained balance shatter like his wife's china hitting concrete. Detective Santos stumbled backward, her smoking gun forgotten as the statue began to dissolve. Not crumble, dissolve, the marble flowing like water mixed with milk, revealing something underneath that Frank's mind refused to process. Bone-white tendrils that might have been roots or veins, pulsing with their own rhythm. A core of black stone carved with symbols that predated every religion he'd ever known. "Dear God," Father Marconi whispered, crossing himself reflexively. "What have we done?" The screaming from the neighboring houses intensified, and Frank understood with crystalline horror exactly what they'd done. The statue hadn't been containing the power, it had been regulating it, metering out miracles and their costs with the precision of a water valve. Now, with that control shattered, 40 years of accumulated debt was being collected all at once. Mrs. Chen's phone rang, shrill and insistent. She answered with trembling hands, her face going grey as she listened. "The hospital," she whispered. "All 3 of my grandchildren just went into cardiac arrest." Paul Torino's radio crackled to life with a stream of emergency calls, strokes, heart attacks, sudden seizures spreading through the neighborhood like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Every life Margaret had saved, every miracle she'd documented in her careful script, was being reclaimed with interest. But it wasn't just the borrowers who were paying. "Vincent," Frank breathed, feeling something fundamental tear in his chest. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Benedetto screaming her son's name, could hear the crash of the wheelchair Vincent wouldn't need again. The statue's dissolution accelerated, the milk-white flow revealing more of the thing underneath. Frank saw now why Margaret had buried it so deep, why she'd wrapped it in marble and painted it with familiar features. The original artifact was obscene in its alien geometry, covered with carvings that seemed to move when viewed directly. This wasn't Christian, wasn't even human. It was something that had been old when the first desperate parent had made their terrible bargain. "It's equalizing," he said, the words tasting like copper. "All those years of imbalance, all those debts, they're all coming due at once." Detective Santos lowered her weapon, horror replacing desperation as she understood what her shot had unleashed. "Sophie," she whispered, then louder, "Sophie." She was running before the word fully left her mouth, crashing through Frank's destroyed front door toward whatever was happening in her own home. The others followed, Mrs. Chen clutching her silent phone, Paul speaking urgently into his radio, Father Marconi murmuring prayers that sounded more like apologies. They fled like survivors of a bombing, leaving Frank alone with the dissolving statue and the weight of revelation crushing down on him. He reached toward the remnants of marble, then jerked his hand back as understanding flooded through him. This was Margaret's final lesson, the truth she'd been too afraid to write in her journal. The statue hadn't been trading lives randomly. It had been working backward through time, undoing every miracle it had ever granted. Vincent's healing legs, Mrs. Patterson's cured diabetes, the Castellano baby's broken fever, all of it being erased in precise reverse order, each supernatural gift torn away from recipients who had lived years or decades, assuming their borrowed health was permanent. And at the end of the chain, 40 years in the past, lay their stillborn son Anthony, the original miracle that had started everything, the impossible life Margaret had begged for in a hospital chapel while their child grew cold. Frank felt the truth hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Margaret hadn't just made a bargain to save other people's children, she'd made it to save their own. Anthony had died at birth, but somehow, through desperation or grief or the intercession of something wearing the Virgin's face, she'd brought him back, hidden him, raised him under another name in another family while she spent 4 decades managing the supernatural debt that one impossible resurrection had created. The marble finished dissolving, leaving only the bone-white alien thing pulsing on his kitchen table like a diseased heart. Frank stared at it and finally understood why breaking the statue wouldn't end anything. The artifact was eternal, patient, designed to outlast the civilizations that found it. Destroying its current vessel would only free it to find another desperate parent, another grieving spouse, another soul willing to trade unknown futures for the chance to save what they couldn't bear to lose. The screaming from the neighborhood was fading now, replaced by the deeper silence of emergency sirens and arriving ambulances. Frank touched his arthritic hands together, feeling his spine curve back into its familiar hunch as the last borrowed strength left his body. Margaret had buried the truth along with the statue, but some secrets were too heavy for Rhode Island soil to hold forever. Frank sat in the wreckage of his kitchen, watching the alien artifact pulse like a malignant heart among the scattered remnants of painted marble. The silence outside had deepened beyond the emergency sirens, a hollow quiet that spoke of lives extinguished and miracles recalled. His arthritic hands ached with renewed vengeance, 40 years of borrowed time extracted in a single devastating moment. But beneath the pain and horror, something else was growing, a cold, practical understanding that felt like Margaret's voice whispering from the deeper chambers of his memory. He reached for her journal with trembling fingers, flipping past the careful records of healings and their costs to pages he'd barely glanced at before. Margaret's handwriting grew smaller here, cramped with urgency, documenting not just what the artifact did, but how it worked, the mechanics of miracles, sketched out in a plumber's daughter's methodical prose. "The entity requires belief to manifest," she'd written. "Desperation focuses its power, but understanding can shape it. The original bargain can be renegotiated if the terms change." Frank's breath caught. Not destroyed, renegotiated. Margaret hadn't just managed the artifact's hunger for 40 years. She'd been studying it, learning its rules like a chess master analyzing an opponent's patterns. And somewhere in these cramped pages was the strategy she'd never lived to implement. His phone rang. Father Marconi's voice came through, crackling with static and barely controlled panic. "Frank, you need to get to the hospital, now. It's not just the neighborhood. Every person who ever touched that statue, everyone who was healed going back decades, they're all here. Some drove hundreds of miles tonight without knowing why." Through his kitchen window, Frank could see them beginning to arrive. Cars with license plates from Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York. Families stumbling out of vehicles with the dazed expression of people following dreams they couldn't quite remember. Mrs. Patterson leaning heavily on her husband, her diabetes returned with diabolic precision. Vincent Benedetto's parents carrying their son toward a wheelchair someone had loaded in their trunk without conscious thought. They were all coming back to the source, drawn by the same force that had once promised them salvation. Frank closed the journal and looked directly at the pulsing artifact. Up close, the bone-white surface revealed itself as something like carved ivory, covered with symbols that shifted when observed peripherally. But Margaret had been right. Understanding could shape it. The more Frank studied the alien geometry, the less it hurt to perceive. Like learning to read a foreign language, each viewing made the next slightly clearer. The front door creaked open, and Detective Santos stepped inside. Her face was hollow, aged a decade in the past hour, but her daughter Sophie leaned against her shoulder, pale and weak but breathing. Behind them came Mrs. Chen supporting two of her grandchildren, then Paul Torino helping an elderly man Frank didn't recognize. "It stopped," Santos said simply. "Whatever was happening, it just stopped, like someone hit a pause button." Frank nodded, pieces clicking together in his mind. "Because I'm still here. Because someone who understands the rules is still connected to it." He gestured toward the artifact. "Margaret spent 40 years learning how to control the balance. That knowledge doesn't die just because she did." Mrs. Chen set her granddaughter gently on Frank's couch, then approached the table with the careful respect of someone handling explosives. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Margaret left instructions." Frank opened the journal to a page near the end, where his wife's handwriting had become almost microscopic. She figured out how to break the cycle, not by destroying the artifact, but by completing it, by making one final bargain that satisfies the debt permanently. Father Marconi appeared in the doorway, his cassock stained with hospital antiseptic. "Frank, whatever you're thinking..." "I'm thinking 40 years ago, my wife made a deal to save our son. Every miracle since then has been compound interest on that original loan." Frank looked around at the assembled faces, parents who'd lost children, children who'd lost parents, all of them bound together by threads of borrowed time. But debts can be transferred. Responsibilities can be inherited. The artifact pulsed brighter, responding to his words like a tuning fork struck at the perfect frequency. Frank felt its attention focus on him with laser intensity, felt it recognizing the shape of his intention. "You're talking about taking her place," Santos whispered. "Becoming the new, what, guardian, curator?" Frank touched Margaret's journal, feeling the weight of all those careful records, all those calculated choices. She managed it alone for 4 decades, kept the balance, minimized the damage, but she was always planning to pass it on. He looked up at the assembled faces, people who'd paid the price, who understood the cost of miracles from both sides. She just never planned on having help. The artifact's pulsing steadied into a rhythm that matched Frank's heartbeat, and he felt something vast and ancient waiting for his answer. The alien artifact's pulse synchronized with Frank's heartbeat, and suddenly he could feel every person in the room like stars in a constellation of shared suffering. Detective Santos clutching her daughter's hand, Mrs. Chen watching her grandchildren breathe with the desperate intensity of someone who'd almost lost everything. Father Marconi gripping his rosary like an anchor in a storm. They were all connected now, not by the statue's false promises, but by the truth of what it cost. "Margaret wrote about a final protocol," Frank said, turning to the journal, last pages where her handwriting became almost illegible in its urgency, a way to satisfy the entity's hunger permanently. But it requires willing participants, people who understand the price and choose to pay it anyway. The artifact pulsed brighter, and Frank felt its alien intelligence pressing against his mind. Not the hungry predator he'd feared, but something closer to a cosmic accountant. Ancient, patient, bound by rules that predated human civilization. It didn't create suffering, it simply redistributed it according to laws carved in bone and star matter. "What kind of price?" Paul Torino asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected. Frank read directly from Margaret's cramped script. The entity feeds on the differential between despair and hope. Every miracle generates a debt of suffering that must be paid by someone, somewhere, somewhen. But if enough people willingly accept small portions of that debt, the compound interest stops accumulating. The hunger gets satisfied without catastrophic collection events. He looked up to find everyone staring at him. She called it distributed suffering. Instead of one person dying so another can live, 100 people accept a little pain so everyone survives. Detective Santos shifted her daughter's weight. Sophie's breathing still labored but steady. "You're talking about forming some kind of supernatural insurance pool?" "More than that." Frank stood, feeling the artifact's attention follow his movement. Margaret realized the entity isn't evil, it's just operating according to its nature. It processes human suffering like a natural force. But natural forces can be harnessed if you understand them well enough. Father Marconi stepped closer to the table, studying the pulsing alien surface with the focus of a man wrestling with theological implications. "What you're describing sounds almost like communion," Frank finished. "Shared sacrifice willingly undertaken." Margaret spent 40 years learning to speak its language, and this is what she discovered. It responds to genuine choice. When people volunteer to bear part of the cost instead of having it forced on them, the mathematics change. Mrs. Chen's eldest granddaughter, barely 12 but old enough to understand, spoke up from the couch. "You mean we could all hurt a little bit instead of some of us dying?" The simplicity of the child's question cut through every adult complication. Frank nodded, feeling tears he didn't know he'd been holding back. "Your grandmother Margaret figured out how to build a bridge between what this thing needs and what we can bear to give. But it only works if everyone chooses it freely." The artifact's pulsing shifted, becoming more complex, not just a heartbeat now but something like harmony, as if it recognized the shape of genuine consensus forming in the room. Frank felt its vast patience, focusing into something approaching approval. "There's no going back," he continued, reading from Margaret's final notes. "Once we commit to this, we become its caretakers permanently. We manage the balance, make the choices, accept the consequences, and our children after us and their children." Detective Santos laughed, a sound sharp with exhaustion and relief. "You mean we get to keep doing exactly what we've been doing, except now we know what we're signing up for?" Frank looked around the room at faces marked by loss and love and the terrible wisdom that came from walking through fire. These weren't the desperate strangers who'd come seeking easy miracles. These were people who'd paid the price, learned the cost, and were still here. "Margaret left specific protocols," he said, opening the journal to pages covered with diagrams and calculations. "Ways to minimize harm, distribute cost, maintain the balance without anyone carrying the full weight alone. But it means we become responsible for every miracle, every healing, every impossible save that happens within our sphere of influence." The artifact's pulsing steadied into something that felt almost like approval. Frank reached toward its surface, then stopped, looking around the room one final time. "She planned this," he said, understanding flooding through him. "Margaret knew this moment would come. She left us instructions, brought us together, made sure we'd understand the choice before we had to make it." He met each pair of eyes in turn. "We can walk away, let someone else find this thing in 50 years, make their own desperate bargains, or we can finish what she started." The alien surface grew warm beneath his palm as Frank made his choice, and felt the other's hands joining his on the ancient ivory, all of them together, accepting the weight of miracles and their costs. Outside, emergency sirens were fading into dawn, and Frank felt the last pieces of his old life settling into place behind him like a door closing softly. The real work was just beginning. The ancient ivory burned like ice against Frank's palm as the other's hands joined his on the artifact's surface. The moment their combined touch completed the circuit, the world exploded into sensation. Not pain, but awareness, so vast it threatened to tear his consciousness apart at the seams. Frank felt every person who had ever touched the entity across centuries of desperate bargains. A Roman senator weeping over his plague-struck daughter, a medieval monk praying for his monastery's salvation, a pioneer woman burying her sixth child in Dakota soil. Their desperation flowed through him like electricity, but underneath the raw anguish ran something else, a thread of gold that was choice, sacrifice freely given rather than extracted by force. "Do you see?" Margaret's voice whispered through the connection, and Frank realized she wasn't gone. None of them were gone. Every person who had ever willingly accepted the entity's burden was still here, woven into its alien consciousness like threads in an impossible tapestry. The artifact pulsed, and suddenly Frank understood its true nature. Not a predator or parasite, but something closer to a cosmic organ, part of a larger system designed to process the universe's suffering like a liver filtering toxins. It had drifted between worlds for eons, always seeking conscious beings capable of making the choice between individual preservation and collective survival. Most species failed the test. They used the entity's power until it consumed them, then died out while the artifact waited patiently for the next civilization to discover it. But occasionally, rarely, a group would figure out the secret Margaret had spent 40 years learning, that the entity could be partnered with rather than simply exploited. Through the connection, Frank felt the weight of that partnership settling onto their small group like a mantle. Detective Santos gasped as she experienced every crime victim she'd ever tried to save, felt their pain become part of her permanent responsibility. Mrs. Chen trembled as the suffering of every grandchild who would ever need healing flowed through her awareness. Father Marconi whispered prayers that transformed into equations, his theological training translating the entity's cosmic mathematics into human understanding. But the burden wasn't crushing, it was distributed. Shared among all of them, the accumulated anguish of centuries became manageable, heavy but bearable, like a weight that would have broken one person's back becoming a load 6 people could carry together. The entity's alien intelligence pressed against Frank's mind, and he felt it asking the question it had posed to every species it encountered. Will you accept responsibility for the suffering you cannot prevent? Will you choose to manage pain rather than simply avoid it? Frank felt the other's hands tighten on the ivory surface as they each faced the same choice. Through the connection, he experienced Detective Santos thinking of every case she'd never been able to solve, every victim she'd arrived too late to save. Mrs. Chen contemplating the inevitable losses that came with loving multiple generations, Father Marconi grappling with theological implications that would reshape his understanding of divine intervention. "We accept," Frank said, speaking for all of them. The words carried the weight of irrevocable commitment, and the artifact pulsed brighter in response. Immediately, Frank felt the entity's hunger begin to stabilize. Instead of the chaotic feast or famine cycle that had characterized its relationship with desperate individuals, it settled into something more like steady consumption, a measured draw on their combined willingness to bear pain on others' behalf. The change was immediate and profound. Through his kitchen window, Frank watched as the desperate pilgrims outside began to straighten, their borrowed time restored not through random redistribution of suffering, but through the group's conscious choice to absorb that cost themselves. Vincent Benedetto's legs strengthened as Frank felt phantom aches bloom in his own joints. Mrs. Patterson's diabetes retreated as Mrs. Chen experienced a brief spike of nausea that passed like a shadow. Small prices, willingly paid. Manageable costs, distributed among people who had chosen to bear them. The artifact's pulsing shifted into complex harmonies, and Frank felt its ancient loneliness beginning to ease. For the first time in eons, it had found partners rather than supplicants, beings capable of working with its nature rather than simply being consumed by it. Through the connection, Margaret's presence grew stronger, her relief palpable. She had managed the entity alone for 40 years, carrying the full weight of its requirements while protecting everyone else from the truth. But she had always planned for this moment, the formation of a true partnership between human consciousness and cosmic necessity. "It's beautiful," Sophie Santos whispered from her mother's arms, and Frank realized the child could see what the rest of them felt, the golden threads of connection now binding them to the entity and through it to every person they would ever help. The artifact settled deeper into stillness, its hunger satisfied not by consumption but by communion. Frank felt his old life, the bitter widower, the failed faith, the meaningless retirement, burning away like tissue paper, replaced by purpose so vast it made his chest ache with possibility. Outside, dawn was breaking over Providence, and Frank Torino felt himself becoming something entirely new. But as the first rays of sunlight struck his kitchen window, the golden threads of connection that had felt so warm and purposeful suddenly turned brittle. Frank's breath caught as he felt something vast and hostile pressing against their newly formed bond, not from the entity but from outside it. The temperature in the room plummeted 20 degrees in seconds. Frost spread across the windows in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and the artifact's harmonious pulsing twisted into discord. Through the psychic link, Frank felt the other's confusion and growing terror as something ancient and infinitely larger than their small partnership turned its attention toward Providence. "What's happening?" Detective Santos gasped, her daughter Sophie whimpering in her arms as the golden threads connecting them all began to fray like overstressed cables. Frank pressed his hands harder against the ivory surface, feeling Margaret's presence flickering like a candle in hurricane winds. Through their connection, her voice came strained with desperate warning, the oversight. "Frank, I never told you about the oversight." The kitchen lights died. Every window in the house shattered simultaneously, spraying glass that hung suspended in mid-air like frozen rain. And through the jagged openings came something that Frank's mind could barely process. A presence so vast that the entity they'd partnered with felt like a grain of sand by comparison. "You have violated the compact," a voice spoke directly into their minds, each word carrying the weight of stellar collapse. The entity was contained, managed. "Your interference has destabilized eons of careful balance." Frank felt his consciousness being crushed under the oversight's attention, like an insect beneath cosmic forces. This was what Margaret had been truly afraid of, not the entity's hunger, but the attention of whatever cosmic authority governed its placement on Earth. They had seen humans successfully partner with their designated trial, and they were not pleased. Through the connection, Frank experienced flashes of the oversight's true scope, a collective intelligence spanning galaxies, ancient beyond human comprehension, tasked with managing species' evolutionary tests across the universe. The entity wasn't just a random artifact, it was an examination carefully calibrated to measure whether humans deserved to survive their technological adolescence. Most species failed by exploiting the entity's power until it consumed them. The few that succeeded were supposed to be gradually weaned away from dependence, not bound into permanent partnership. Frank and his group had broken fundamental rules by choosing synthesis over either destruction or abandonment. "The test is compromised," the oversight continued, its attention pressing down on them like the weight of dead stars. "Correction is required." Father Marconi screamed as theological certainties, that had anchored his faith for 60 years shattered under cosmic truths too vast for human understanding. Mrs. Chen collapsed, her grandchildren's future suffering hitting her consciousness like physical blows as the oversight demonstrated the true scale of what they'd committed to managing. But Frank held on. Through the chaos of revelation and terror, he felt Margaret's desperate whisper guiding him toward the journal's final pages, entries she did hidden even from herself, written in a code that only made sense when cosmic forces were literally crushing your ability to think. "The oversight fears partnership," he read aloud, his voice barely audible through the psychic storm. "They've never encountered a species that chose synthesis. They don't know how to process it. Their fear makes them vulnerable." The suspended glass began orbiting the room like a slow-motion tornado, each shard reflecting distorted glimpses of the oversight's true form, something like crystallized mathematics given predatory intent. Frank felt his sanity fraying as he tried to comprehend beings that existed as living equations, for whom consciousness was just another variable to be optimized. But through the entity, he also felt something unexpected, its own terror. The artifact had never intended to attract the oversight's attention. For eons, it had operated within carefully established parameters, processing suffering according to cosmic regulations. Their partnership had created something new, something unplanned, and now they were all facing consequences that could reshape reality itself. "They can be bargained with," Margaret's voice urged, "but not for our lives, for our choice. For the right to prove synthesis works better than their traditional tests." Frank understood. This wasn't just about saving themselves. It was about fundamentally challenging how the universe measured species' worthiness to survive. The oversight wasn't evil, just infinitely conservative, terrified that deviation from tested protocols might lead to cosmic catastrophe. As the crushing weight of their attention threatened to pulverize his consciousness entirely, Frank made the most important choice of his life. Instead of begging for mercy or trying to undo what they'd done, he opened himself completely to the oversight's judgment, while simultaneously tightening his grip on the entity and his human partners. "We choose to be tested," he said, his words carrying across dimensional barriers. "Not by your old rules, but by the new ones we've created. Judge us by what we can accomplish together, not by how well we fit your existing categories." The oversight's attention focused on him like the gravity of a collapsing star, and Frank Torino felt himself becoming the focal point of a cosmic argument that would determine humanity's future. The oversight's attention compressed around Frank like the moment before a star's death, and he felt his individual consciousness beginning to dissolve under pressures that could reshape matter. But instead of fighting the dissolution, he surrendered to it, and in that surrender discovered something the cosmic entities had never encountered. His awareness expanded beyond the boundaries of his aging body, flowing through the golden threads that connected him to the others. He became Detective Santos's fierce protectiveness for her daughter, Mrs. Chen's patient love spanning generations, Father Marconi's wrestling faith. Through the entity, he touched every person they'd helped, Vincent Benedetto's grateful tears, Mrs. Patterson's quiet relief, Sophie's innocent wonder. "This is what partnership means," Frank projected toward the oversight, his thoughts carrying the full weight of human connection. Not just managing suffering, but transforming it into something greater. The crystalline mathematics of the oversight's form fluctuated, processing data that didn't fit their ancient algorithms. For eons, they had watched species either exploit the entity until destruction or eventually abandon it as they evolved beyond need. The concept of permanent synthesis, conscious beings choosing to permanently interweave their existence with cosmic responsibility, created paradoxes in their fundamental understanding. Frank felt Margaret's presence growing stronger and realized she was drawing power from every person who had ever willingly touched the entity. Centuries of accumulated choice coalesced into a force the oversight couldn't simply dismiss. This wasn't rebellion against cosmic order. It was evolution beyond what their tests had been designed to measure. "Show them," Margaret whispered, and Frank understood. He opened his memories completely, not just to the oversight, but through the entity to every connected consciousness across the galaxy. His grief over Maria's death transformed through 40 years into compassion for others facing loss. The bitter atheism that had hardened into wisdom about enduring pain without losing hope. His terror at discovering the statue alchemized into acceptance of responsibility larger than himself. The others joined him. Detective Santos shared every victim she'd failed to save, becoming fuel for her determination to protect those she still could. Mrs. Chen offered her understanding that love's price was watching those you cherish suffer and choosing to love anyway. Father Marconi presented his faith not as certainty, but as commitment to serve something greater, despite never fully comprehending it. Through the entity, their combined revelation rippled outward to every world where the Oversight conducted their tests. Species across the galaxy suddenly glimpsed an alternative to the ancient binary of destruction or abandonment, a third path where conscious beings evolved not beyond their trials, but deeper into partnership with them. The effect was immediate and profound. The Oversight's crystalline certainty began developing fractures as their carefully ordered universe revealed new possibilities. Frank felt their collective consciousness struggling to process implications that threatened to revolutionize cosmic policy spanning millions of years. "You offer to sacrifice your species' natural evolution," they projected, confusion bleeding through their mathematical perfection, "to remain permanently bound to responsibility for universal suffering. This serves no survival advantage." Frank smiled, feeling the weight of his 62 years and every lesson they'd taught him. "That's what makes it a choice instead of an instinct. We're not doing this because it helps us survive. We're doing it because it's right." The suspended glass in his kitchen began moving in new patterns, reflecting not destruction but possibility. Through the entity, Frank felt other species across the galaxy stirring towards similar partnerships. Inspired by humanity's unprecedented choice, the Oversight's great test was revealing itself as something far more complex than pass or fail, a catalyst for evolution they themselves hadn't anticipated. But their approval came with a price Frank hadn't expected. Very well, the Oversight decided, their attention shifting into something that felt almost like respect. "Humanity will be permitted to continue this synthesis. But understand, your choice binds not just your small group, but your entire species. From this moment forward, every human born will inherit connection to the entity's network. You have made this decision for billions who will never have the opportunity to choose otherwise." The weight of that revelation struck Frank like a physical blow. He'd thought they were accepting responsibility for their community, their city at most. But the Oversight operated on species-wide scales. Their partnership with the entity would become humanity's defining characteristic, passed down genetically like eye color or blood type. Through the connection, he felt the others grappling with the same terrible understanding. They hadn't just chosen for themselves, they'd chosen for every child who would ever be born, every future generation that would inherit both the ability to ease suffering and the cosmic responsibility that came with it. Sophie Santos looked up at him with eyes that already held more wisdom than any 6-year-old should possess, and Frank realized the transformation was beginning immediately. The children would adapt, evolve, become something humanity had never been before. The price of victory wasn't his life or even his humanity. It was humanity itself, forever changed by his choice. The Oversight's attention began withdrawing, leaving behind silence pregnant with infinite consequence. The silence that followed the Oversight's withdrawal felt heavier than their crushing presence had been. Frank's kitchen, with its shattered windows and suspended glass, looked like the aftermath of a cosmic storm, which he supposed it was. The glass finally fell, tinkling to the floor in a cascade of frozen music, and the artifact's glow dimmed to something almost peaceful. Frank's hand shook as he released his grip on the ivory surface. Around the table, the others sat in stunned contemplation of what they'd done. Detective Santos held Sophie closer, studying her daughter's face for signs of the transformation that was already beginning. The child's eyes held new depths, ancient patience that belonged in no 6-year-old's gaze. "We changed everything," Father Marconi whispered, his voice hollow with awe and terror. "Every human who will ever be born." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, her weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of their choice. "My great-grandchildren will inherit what we decided here. Children not yet conceived will carry this responsibility." Through the windows, Frank could see the pilgrims scattered across his yard beginning to stir. Their borrowed time had been restored, but now they carried something new, a subtle awareness, the beginning of connection to the network that would define humanity's future. Vincent Benedetto stood on strong legs, but his expression showed he understood the price that had been paid for his healing. The entity's presence settled deeper into Frank's consciousness, no longer alien but becoming part of him. He felt Margaret's joy flowing through the connection, her 40 years of solitary burden finally shared, her impossible dream of true partnership achieved. But underneath her relief, he sensed her own wrestling with the scope of their decision. "Did we have the right," Detective Santos asked, voicing what they were all thinking, "to make this choice for everyone?" Frank stood slowly, his arthritic joints moving without pain but somehow feeling heavier than before. He walked to the broken window and looked out at Providence waking to a new dawn. In the distance he could see people emerging from their homes, pausing on doorsteps with expressions of confused wonder as they felt the first stirrings of connection to something vast and purposeful. "I keep thinking about Maria," he said quietly, "about watching her suffer and being helpless to change it, about every person who's ever had to bury a child or watch someone they love disappear into addiction or face illness they can't fight." He touched the window frame where frost still clung despite the morning warmth. How many generations have lived and died feeling that helplessness? Sophie Santos slipped from her mother's arms and walked to Frank's side, her small hand finding his. Through the touch, he felt her acceptance of what she would become, someone capable of easing pain at the cost of carrying it. The responsibility didn't frighten her the way it terrified the adults. "Children will adapt better than we will," Frank realized aloud. "To them, this won't feel like a burden imposed. It'll just be what humans can do." Mrs. Chen stood and began carefully sweeping the glass, her movements methodical and soothing. "Every generation faces challenges the previous one created. This is ours to leave them, the ability to heal and the wisdom to understand that healing requires sacrifice." Father Marconi removed his collar and set it on the table beside the artifact, his theological certainties shattered, but his faith somehow intact. "I need to rethink everything I thought I knew about divine will, but maybe that's what faith really means, staying committed to love even when understanding fails." Through the entity, Frank felt the network expanding as more humans unconsciously joined the connection. Each new link brought flashes of their suffering and their capacity for compassion. A mother in Seattle feeling her son's addiction as her own pain. A doctor in Mumbai accepting the weight of every patient she couldn't save. An elderly man in Wales sharing his loneliness until it became manageable. The transformation wasn't dramatic or supernatural. It was subtle, profound, fundamentally human. People didn't suddenly develop miraculous powers. Instead, they developed the ability to truly share their burdens, to transform individual anguish into collective responsibility. "What happens now?" Detective Santos asked, though Frank suspected she already knew. "Now we learn how to be what we've become," Frank answered. He felt Margaret's presence beginning to fade, her vigil finally complete, but her love remained, woven into the network like a foundation stone. We teach others how to carry this responsibility without being crushed by it. We figure out how to raise children who will inherit capabilities we're still learning to understand. The artifact pulsed gently, no longer hungry but content. Through it, Frank felt the entity's ancient gratitude and something like friendship. They were partners now, bound together not by desperation but by choice. Outside, Providence was waking to its first morning as part of humanity's new chapter. Frank Torino, who had begun this journey as a bitter widower digging up his dead garden, now stood as one of the architects of his species' transformation. The resolution was complete, but the real work was just beginning, the return. 3 months later, Frank stood in his backyard where it had all begun, watching the November frost claim the last of the autumn flowers. The garden he'd abandoned to grief had become something extraordinary, not through divine intervention, but through the patient hands of neighbors who understood that healing required tending. Mrs. Chen knelt by the memorial stone they'd placed where the statue had been buried, her movements careful as she tucked bulbs into the earth that would bloom come spring. Sophie Santos sat cross-legged nearby, her small fingers trailing over fallen leaves while she practiced what she'd started calling the listening, that quiet attention to others' pain that came as naturally to her now as breathing. The transformation had settled into Providence like snow, accumulating gradually until the landscape of human connection looked entirely different. Frank no longer needed to consciously reach for the network. It had become as fundamental as his heartbeat. Through it, he felt the city's pulse, not just its suffering, but its growing capacity to carry that suffering collectively. Detective Santos emerged from the house, carrying a tray of coffee that steamed in the cold air. She moved differently now, Frank noticed, still alert, still protective, but without the brittle tension that had defined her before. Her daughter's brief illness had taught her something about helplessness. Their partnership with the entity had given her tools to transform that understanding into strength. "Vincent called," she said, settling beside Frank on the garden bench they'd built from salvaged wood. "The support group he started has 30 families now, parents who've lost children, helping each other carry the weight." Frank nodded, unsurprised. Vincent Benedetto had embraced his role as one of the first to experience the network's healing, using his restored mobility to reach others trapped in their own forms of paralysis. The ripple effects were impossible to track fully. Conversations between strangers on buses, neighbors checking on elderly residents, children instinctively comforting classmates they sensed were struggling. Father Marconi approached through the garden gate, no longer wearing his collar but somehow more obviously a man of faith than he'd ever been. His theological crisis had resolved not into new certainties, but into a deeper acceptance of mystery. He'd taken to calling their transformation practical divinity, the sacred made manifest through choice rather than revelation. "The delegation from Washington arrives tomorrow," he said, settling onto a wooden crate that served as additional seating. "They want to understand how to replicate the Providence model in other cities." Frank almost smiled. Government officials still thought in terms of programs and policies, unable to grasp that what they'd achieved couldn't be bottled or distributed. The network grew through connection, not coercion. Each new person drawn in by genuine relationship rather than bureaucratic mandate. "Let them observe," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying the patience of someone who'd learned to think in generations rather than election cycles. "They'll understand eventually, or they won't. The network doesn't need their permission to spread." Sophie looked up from her leaf sorting with the unsettling wisdom that had become her defining characteristic. "It's already in other cities. Jamie's cousin in Boston felt it last week. And there's a group in San Francisco that started without knowing about us." Through the network, Frank sensed the truth of her words. Humanity's evolution was proceeding organically, person by person, choice by choice. The oversight's imposed transformation had provided the capacity, but each individual still had to consciously embrace the responsibility. Most did, eventually. The alternative, remaining isolated with private pain, grew less appealing once people glimpsed the possibility of shared burden. Margaret's presence had faded to barely perceptible warmth, but Frank felt her satisfaction like sunlight through winter clouds. Her decades of lonely preparation had succeeded beyond her wildest hopes. The terrible price she'd hidden, their stillborn son's soul traded for the entity's partnership, had purchased something unprecedented, conscious evolution guided by love rather than survival pressure. The artifact itself sat in Frank's kitchen still, though its role had transformed completely. No longer a source of miraculous healing, it served as anchor and amplifier for the network, ensuring stability as more minds joined the collective. Pilgrims still came, but seeking understanding rather than cures, leaving with tools for healing that required no relics. "My arthritis came back," Frank said quietly, flexing his fingers against the cold. The others looked at him with concern, but he continued, "I'm glad. The pain reminds me I'm still human, still mortal, just not alone with it anymore." Detective Santos touched his shoulder. "None of us are alone with it anymore." As darkness settled over Providence, Frank felt the city's dreams beginning. Thousands of minds relaxing into sleep while remaining gently connected. Nightmares shared until they lost their power to terrorize. Hopes amplified through collective witness. The network didn't eliminate suffering, but it had eliminated the isolation that made suffering unbearable. He was no longer the bitter widower who'd reluctantly dug up his dead garden. That man had died the moment he chose partnership over protection, evolution over preservation. What remained was someone larger than Frank Torino had ever imagined possible, still himself, but connected to something infinite. The return was complete. He was home, among his people, forever changed and changing others in turn. The new beginning. Spring came early to Providence that year, and with it, a quiet revolution that most of the world still didn't understand. Frank stood in his garden on a warm April morning, watching Sophie Santos, now 7 and impossibly wise, teach a group of children how to tend the memorial flowers. Her patient explanations of soil preparation mixed seamlessly with gentle instruction on feeling what the plants needed, a skill that would have seemed impossible just 8 months ago. The children accepted it all with the adaptability of youth. To them, sensing others' emotions and sharing difficult feelings wasn't supernatural. It was simply what humans could do, like walking or speaking. Frank marveled at how naturally they embraced capabilities that still left the adults struggling to understand their new reality. "The Baltimore delegation wants to visit next week," Detective Santos said, joining him beside the memorial stone. She'd been appointed as the unofficial liaison for government officials trying to document what they called the Providence phenomenon. Her patient explanations that the network couldn't be imposed or replicated fell on deaf ears, but she continued the work anyway. Frank nodded absently, his attention caught by something more significant. Through the network, he felt a familiar presence approaching. Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, the oncologist who'd first examined Sophie's impossible recovery. She'd resisted the network for months, her scientific training warring with evidence that defied explanation. But grief had finally worn down her defenses. She appeared at the garden gate, her professional composure cracked by recent loss. Frank felt her pain through the connection. A young patient, barely 3 years old, lost despite every medical intervention. The guilt and helplessness radiated from her like heat from a fever. "I felt him die," she said without preamble, tears streaming down her face. "Through whatever this is, I felt that little boy's fear, and I couldn't make it easier for him." Sophie looked up from her flower lesson, her ancient eyes full of compassion. "You can't stop people from dying," she said gently, "but you can make sure they don't die alone. That's what the network is for." Frank felt the exact moment Dr. Reyes truly joined them, not just touching the network's edges, but surrendering to its fundamental purpose. Her medical training, her knowledge of human suffering, her deep commitment to healing flowed into the collective understanding. She gasped as she felt the city's pain, but also its capacity to carry that pain together. Mrs. Chen emerged from the house, carrying a thermos of tea, her movements graceful despite her 84 years. The network had given her something she'd never expected to find again, purpose beyond survival. She'd become their unofficial guide for navigating the challenges of expanded empathy, teaching others how to feel deeply without drowning. "The children adapt fastest," she said. settling beside Dr. Reyes with the confidence of someone who'd spent months helping professionals accept their new reality. But we all adapt eventually. The alternative becomes inconceivable. Through the network, Frank felt the truth of her words. In Providence, isolation had become nearly extinct. People still maintained individual personalities and private thoughts, but the bone-deep loneliness that had defined human existence for millennia was disappearing. Children grew up expecting emotional support from their community. Adults faced crises knowing their burden would be shared. Father Marconi arrived with Vincent Benedetto, both men carrying supplies for the weekly gathering they'd established in Frank's backyard. What had started as an informal support group had evolved into something unprecedented, a regular assembly where dozens of people practiced the skills their transformation required, learning to share emotional burdens without being overwhelmed, discovering how to offer comfort without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, accepting that consciousness itself had evolved. 26 cities now, Vincent reported, his restored mobility allowing him to travel and document the network's spread. And it's not just in the United States anymore. There's a cluster in Manchester, England, another in Adelaide, Australia, always starting with someone who visited here but growing organically. Frank smiled, remembering the oversight's warning about binding humanity's future. They'd feared making the choice for generations not yet born, but those generations were embracing their inheritance with enthusiasm. Birth rates had actually increased as parenting became a truly communal responsibility. Mental illness rates were plummeting. Violence dropped when potential aggressors felt their victims' pain as acutely as their own. The artifact still sat on his kitchen table, though its dramatic glow had settled into something peaceful. Pilgrims no longer came seeking miraculous cures. They came to understand how healing actually worked, how suffering transformed from unbearable isolation into manageable community responsibility, how consciousness could evolve through choice rather than chance. As afternoon faded into evening, Frank found himself surrounded by the people who'd become his true family, not bound by blood or law, but by their shared commitment to carrying each other's burdens. Sophie fell asleep against his shoulder while the adults discussed plans for a community center, her dreams flowing gently through the network like shared music. Margaret's presence had long since faded, but her love remained woven into the foundation of everything they'd built. Her desperate bargain 40 years ago had purchased humanity's next evolutionary step. The terrible price she'd paid, their son's soul, had transformed into countless children who would never face suffering alone. Frank Torino was 73 now, his body bearing the honest weight of age, but his spirit connected to something infinite. The bitter widower who'd reluctantly dug up his dead garden was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true healing required not the elimination of pain, but the courage to share it. The beginning was complete. Humanity had learned to tend its garden of suffering together, and the flowers blooming from that shared responsibility were more beautiful than any individual miracle could have been.